Welcome to MCASA's update on new laws that passed in Maryland in the 2025 legislative session. The Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault is the coalition of all of the rape crisis centers across the state of Maryland and also includes people like you who are interested in ending sexual violence. Please join us and help support our efforts. We're talking today about laws that passed in Annapolis. So these are not federal laws, these are things that affect our state laws. The first thing we're going to talk about is money. Funding for victim services, of course, is vital to survivors across the state of Maryland and increasingly a very serious concern for all of us here in Maryland. Last year, we had a number of successes. We had a proposal to cut the Victim Services Stabilization Act that was defeated. And we also had a proposal to cut the Rape Kit Testing Fund. That was also not only defeated, but we enacted a bill to continue the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative as long as the backlog exists. And finally, there was continued general funding support for rape crisis centers, and a special shout out to Chair Ben Barnes and Chair Guy Gazzoni for their support of rape crisis centers and victim services across the state of Maryland. In terms of policy bills, a number of important bills passed. First, we had a bill about deep fakes. So Senate Bill 360 is going to allow for the prosecution of the distribution of deep fakes, whether they're actual images, computer-generated images, or a combination of the two. The new law also clarifies that a survivor has a civil cause of action and that a prevailing plaintiff may be awarded attorney's fees. In the area of rape kits, as I mentioned before, we continued support for the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, and that's hugely important because we still have thousands of untested rape kits. And this bill is going to ensure that Maryland fulfills its promise to survivors to not only test the rape kit backlog, but also to investigate cases, consider prosecution, and importantly, to support survivors. Part of that legislation also increases access to exams by allowing telesafe projects to receive funding. Moving on to protective orders, there was a bill that passed that will increase access to permanent, lifelong protective orders. It allows courts to issue a permanent protective order when the respondent consents, something that we couldn't do before. In the area of military peace and protective orders, we did a couple of things, authorizing a Maryland judge to consider that a military protective order is in place when they're considering whether or not to issue a temporary civil order, and also requiring civil law enforcement to notify military authorities when they believe an order has been violated. For peace orders, we made an improvement regarding visual surveillance. There was a case where a neighbor was filming teenage girls sunbathing in the yard next to his, and the court felt that it really had no authority to address this issue. So the legislature added intentional surveillance of a person's residence, including yards, whenever there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that's now in the definition of harassment, and also amended the peace order to specifically permit the court to order repositioning of devices that are used for surveillance. A hugely important and really major law passed about custody decision making. As you know, child custody is often one of the most important things for a survivor of intimate partner violence, including intimate partner sexual violence. They codified factors to be considered whenever the court's making a decision about custody of the child, and they included protections for survivors of abuse. This means that those factors are going to be easier to find and much more helpful to litigants and courts throughout Maryland. There were changes in civil cases. The Child Victims Act was a major case that permitted survivors to sue for damages long after the abuse occurred. It was passed in 2023. It imposed some caps for liability, but once the law passed, the state realized that they were facing billions of dollars in liability. So they reduced the amount of money that would have to be paid out, and they also reduced the fees that attorneys could charge. MCASA really recognizes the need to ensure that the state is solvent and has the ability to continue to help all survivors. We do have grave concerns about the decisions that were made to limit these claims, regardless of the number of assailants or the severity and frequency of the abuse or harm. Changes were made in the education area. There was a bill that passed about health curricula, and this will require that local school districts include age-appropriate discussions of a whole range of topics as part of their school health curricula. This includes human sexuality, gender identity and sexual orientation, safety and violence prevention, consent, and safe and appropriate social media and internet use. Learning about these topics can really be a lifeline for students facing abuse or risk of abuse. Another bill passed about visual surveillance, this one about the crime of visual surveillance with prurient intent. It clarifies that the prohibition against visual surveillance with prurient intent applies in private residences, and that it also increases the penalty for this crime when the crime involved a minor. A bill passed about the transmission of HIV. There was a separate law that prohibited the intentional transmission of HIV. An advice letter from the Attorney General's office opined that this really is already covered under reckless endangerment. And this separate law was having negative public health consequences and really rooted in discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. So that's been repealed, and reckless endangerment can continue to be used to punish this horrible crime. A bill passed on marital communications. This changed the law on when communications between spouses can be used as evidence in criminal cases. It clarified that a spouse in this situation includes a former spouse, and it establishes that a spouse who's an alleged victim may disclose those confidential communications between spouses as long as they occurred during the marriage. It's a criminal action, and one spouse is charged with the crime against the other spouse. This all remains the victim's choice. There was a bill that passed on animals that will allow each abused animal to be treated as a separate victim for purposes of sentencing. The Second Look Act was a huge criminal law act. It establishes a process for inmates who have been incarcerated for at least 20 years, but they committed their crime when they were young, between the ages of 18 and 25, and it just permits them to have their sentence reviewed. There were some important provisions regarding survivors and sex offenders in this bill. First of all, the process is not available to people who are convicted sex offenders. And also, very importantly, there are protections for victims' rights, including automatic orders to stay away from victims unless the victim and their families request otherwise. A bill passed about child abuse victim testimony versus closed circuit video. Court decisions had led to a situation where this law was practically useless and really rarely applied. So the legislature clarified that the standard is that the child would suffer serious emotional distress if they had to testify in the courtroom. It also requires that the testimony in the courthouse is in a setting that mitigates the likelihood of further emotional distress. Both the child and the defendant must have counsel before closed circuit TV testimony can be taken. A bill passed about commercial DNA. This is very important in sexual assault cases where we have a rape kit available. It clarified that it's not necessary for police to exhaust absolutely every single investigative lead before they seek an order to search a commercial DNA database. A bill passed about human trafficking, the See Someone, Save Someone bill. This requires the Department of Transportation to develop and implement a training program for transportation sector employees on the identification and reporting of suspected child exploitation and human trafficking victims. This is hugely important in locating these survivors and getting them the help that they need. U visas are part of our immigration system, and the immigration system is primarily a federal function. However, we passed a bill that created a few survivor-centered improvements here at the local level, the state level. It expands the people who are involved in the certification process. It increased some of the timelines, and it clarified procedures, doing what we can to improve the immigration system at the state level. One of the most boring bills of the session was also very important for those of you in the nonprofit realm. It will require that the state bring the indirect cost rate for grants to 15%, and it's automatic. It's something as of right. So if you have a grant from the state, you can require that 15% of your grant be allocated to indirect costs. It really just simplifies grant administration and it permits more funds to be used for services instead of red tape. The final bill that passed I'll talk about is the Abortion Care Grant Fund. This established the Public Health Abortion Grant Program, and that helps provide clinical services for people who are in Maryland seeking abortion care. Those are some of the bills that passed this past session in 2025. A few things to think about for next session. We'll have a return of the Stop Silencing Survivors bill. This bill helps to prevent litigation from being used as a weapon to silence survivors. All across the country, including in Maryland, there's a real trend of assailants suing survivors after the survivor discloses sexual assault. Many of these cases allege defamation, but some include other causes of action, such as intentional infliction of emotional distress or malicious prosecution. This legislation proposes immunity for disclosure of sexual assault unless the disclosure is made recklessly or intentionally false or actual malice. We'll have more legislation improving abortion access. We'll try to improve these shielding laws so people who come from out of state can have confidence that their medical records won't be accessed. People in the state can have confidence that everything that they talk about regarding their reproductive care is private. This is very important for rape survivors. 5% of rape survivors of reproductive age become pregnant from that rape. And almost 3 million women in the US have experienced rape-related pregnancy. So MCASA will continue to advocate on this important issue. The budget, once again, will be a big issue next session. We have not only state challenges with the revenue, but also the effect of the federal issues, the shutdown, the high number of layoffs that really affect the state of Maryland and consequently affect our coffers are going to be a challenge for everyone, including people providing victim services to survivors. We'll try once again to improve the law about audio recordings. Maryland currently has an all-party consent rule for audio, but not video, recordings. Several survivors have taped their rape, and that evidence was not only inadmissible, but it made the survivors themselves felons. Last session, we almost got something done when the Senate passed a bill to give judges the discretion to admit these recordings in cases involving crimes against a person. Next session, we're going to continue this effort and hopefully find something that balances both the importance of audio evidence in court and also people's privacy. We're going to try to protect the identity of all survivors by expanding a previously passed bill that protects the identity of minors to include all sexual assault survivors. So when they go to court, their names will be protected. And finally, we have a bill that will be introduced again to update Maryland's statutory language from child pornography to the more accurate description of child sex abuse materials. More will, of course, come up during session, and we need your help. Please go to MCASA's website, sign up for alerts, and every year I ask everyone to really speak up, speak out. Everyone, please do 3 things during session at least. You can pick the 3 things, 3 emails, 3 texts, an email, a text, a visit. Come to Annapolis, speak up, speak out, let your legislators know that you care about the needs of survivors and that you expect them to also. Thank you again.